Sripada Paramahansa Parivrajikacharya Stotara Sadashi Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Goswami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupada Paramahansa Parivrajikacharya Stotara Sadashi Srimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. ISKCON Founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Segaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Go Gopinath Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhana Ki Jai. Shri Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Shri Navari Dham Ki Jai. Shri Shri Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Shri Shri Mathura Dham Ki Jai. Shri Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. Narayanam Namaskritam Naram Chaivam Narotaram Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudidayat. Nasta Prayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shlokir Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtiki. Reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, 5th chapter, texts number 31 and 32.
30 and 31.
30 and 31. Aham tadvad vukarunayam Mano vakari kaya rahaput Vaikarikas chaye deva Arta bhuvya gyanam yataha Aham tatvad vikurvanam Mano vikari karabut Vikarika ye deva Artu burya nam yahataha Arta bhuvya gyanam yataha Aham tadvad vikaranam Mano vakarika sabut Vaikarika ye deva Arta bhishya gyanam yataha Aham tatvat. From the principle of false ego. Vikarvanat. By transformation. Manaha. The mind. Vaikarikat, by interaction with the mode of goodness. Abhut, generated. Vaikarika, by interaction with goodness. Cha, also. Yea, all these. Devaha, demigods. Artha, the phenomenon. Abhiyagyanam, physical knowledge. Yataha, the source. Translation: the false ego is transformed into mind by interaction with the mode of goodness. All the demigods who control a phenomenal world are also products of the same principle, namely the interaction of false ego and the mode of goodness. Purport: false ego interacting with different modes of nature, of material nature, is the source of all materials in the phenomenal world. Taja, I don't think that's on the board, it's number 31, is it?
No.
Taje Sida Indriyanya Eva Jnana Karma Mayana Mayani Cha Taijasani, the mode of fashion. Indriyani, the senses. Eva, certainly. Jnana, knowledge. Jnana, knowledge, philosophical speculations. Karma, fruitive activities, mayani, predominating, cha, also. Translation by Srila Prabhupada. The senses are generally products of the mode of passion in false ego, and therefore philosophical speculative knowledge and fruitive activities are predominantly products of the mode of passion. Responsibly, the senses are certainly products of the mode of passion in false ego. And therefore, philosophical speculative knowledge and fruitive activities are predominantly products of the mode of passion. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The chief functions of the false ego is godlessness. When a person forgets his constitutional position as an eternally subordinate part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and wants to be happy independently, he functions mainly in two ways. He first attempts to act fruitively for personal gain or sense gratification, and after attempting such fruitive activities for a considerable time, when he is frustrated, he becomes a philosophical speculator and thinks himself to be on the same level as God. This false idea of becoming one with the Lord is the last snare of the illusory energy, which traps a living entity into the bondage of forgetfulness under the spell of false ego. The best means of liberation from the clutches of false ego is to give up the habit of philosophical speculation regarding the absolute truth. One should know definitely that the absolute truth is never realized by the philosophical speculation of the imperfect, egoistic person. The absolute truth, or the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is realized by hearing about Him in all submission and love from a bona fide authority who is representative of the 12 great authorities mentioned in the Srimad Bhagavatam. By such an attempt only can one conquer the illusory energy of the Lord, although for others she is insurpassable, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 7.14. Verse again. The senses are certainly products of the mode of passion and false ego, and therefore philosophical speculative knowledge and fruitive activities are predominantly products of the mode of passion. Prabhupada says in the purport to this verse that the chief function of the false ego is godlessness. And godlessness is basically forgetfulness of Krishna. Sometimes it is put forward that demonic people are by nature demonic, but in another sense they are forgetful. They are just forgetful. Nitya Siddha Krishna Prema Saja Kavanai Shravanadi Shuddha Chitte Karye Udai. It is stated in the Srimad Bhagavatam that actually everyone is Krishna conscious, but some are forgetful, and therefore there is the Ekavad Vibhuti. There is the 1/4 of the creation that's material due to forgetfulness. So the Krishna consciousness movement is the process of awakening consciousness of a remembrance of Krishna. And when one remembers Krishna, one is able to be satisfied. As Prabhupada states, by such an attempt only, one can conquer the illusory energy of the Lord, although for others she is insurpassable, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 7.14, which says, Daivishesha gunamayi mama maya doratya mamevaye papadyante mayametan tarantite, that this material nature is very, very difficult to overcome. But one who is surrendered unto me, Krishna says, can easily cross beyond it. So, if one goes to spiritually advanced persons for instruction, one is considered to be spiritually advanced. Even though Vidura, as is said, has heard these pastimes many, many times. He was actually Yamaraj in a past life, who knows the mentality of everybody, a bona fide mind reader. But wanting to hear from Maitreya, because Maitreya was a very advanced person, and wanting to hear again and again. And as Prabhupada says in an earlier part of this chapter, that one never tires about hearing the pastimes of the Lord. Although after reading the material things, one can hear them maybe once or twice or three times, and after that it becomes hackneyed or boring. And topics that relate to Krishna Katha are transcendental and can be heard many, many times, and each time one gets a deeper realization. So the previous verse says, the false ego is transformed into mind by interaction. One of the meanings of this statement is that everything actually has to proceed from subtle forms to gross forms. We have experience with the local government, for example, that before beginning a construction project, they want to know all the details. All the planning has to be there. So the planning stage is the first stage and is the most important stage. And in Krishna consciousness, everything develops from a very subtle plane. Like just hearing two syllables, ta and pa, or tapa, or austerity. Lord Brahma was able to create the entire universe just by hearing these two syllables, ta and pa. So from the very subtle tapa to the very gross, the material world is a very complicated thing. There are many different forms of living entities, birds, beasts, plants, human beings, and they're all very different. They have different mentalities. And based on these differences, things do go forward. Prabhupada approved of the concept of what someone called transcendental competition, who's distributing the most books, who's making the most devotees, who's opening the most temples. That is the way we are competitive. So we all have a competitive nature. We all think we're better than everyone else in the material world. In the spiritual world, that concept does not exist. We think that everyone is better than we are, but in the material world, we think we're better than everyone. So that's the difference between material and spiritual. And then one is remembering Krishna. One thinks that another service is great. That should be glorified rather than cut down. So the cutting down process is always there. And as Prabhupada mentions in the purport to this second verse, one tries to benefit completely from material knowledge. And when one fails in that, one thinks, of course this is more prominent in some countries than others, one thinks that one is equal to God. And Prabhupada says this is the last snare of material energy. Thinks himself to be on the same level. The false idea of becoming one with the Lord is the last snare of the illusory energy, which traps a living entity into bondage of forgetfulness under the spell of false ego. So it is said that there are two different types of human beings, the Nitya-satttas and the Nitya-baddhas. And so Nitya means without beginning or without end or eternal. And so we wonder sometimes how there can be the ekapad vibhuti, or the material world in which people are eternally forgetful. So that's a great mystery that no one has solved yet. And Prabhupada has said that it's impossible for us to trace out the beginning of how we left the spiritual association of Krishna, but we did, and that's what forms this forgetfulness of the material world. So a devotee tries to do his or her best to awaken people to remember Krishna. And this is done mainly through the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra. There are different ways of chanting. There was a time when Prabhupada first came to San Francisco. I'm going to segue into a little story about Prabhupada's first visit to San Francisco. He was in New York. And San Francisco is quite a long ways. It's on the other side of the country. I think it was named after St. Francis of Assisi. But it's a very picturesque and beautiful city. It has a lot of hills, very steep hills. In fact, there's one street that's so steep that the road zigzags. It doesn't go straight up to the top of it. It goes back and forth so that the cars won't tip over. So that's called Lombard Street. So anyway, it was decided that we would ask Prabhupada to come to San Francisco from New York, and it's a long ways away, maybe 400 kilometers. It's right on the other side of the country. Those of you who are not familiar with the United States, the East Coast is a long ways away from the West Coast. So I went into this was the first time Prabhupada had made such a big journey during his manifest pastimes on earth. And I remember going into a telephone booth and putting in a lot of coins to reach New York. And finally, Prabhupada came on the line. And we said that we would like him to, we would invite him. He'd have a place to stay in San Francisco. And at the end of near the end of the conversation, he said, are you going to pay for my transit? And so we had a little conference. I was in the phone booth with another devotee. And the conference was that we would pay the ticket here. And so Prabhupada wasn't familiar with this idea of prepaying a ticket in another part of the country. At that time, it was very common. And so we told Prabhupada that you could just go to the ticket counter of United Airlines and give your name, and they would let you on the plane. The ticket would be transferred electronically and that's what happened, and that's what happened. So this was probably one of the only, if not the only, airplane flight that Prabhupada took. And as we will hear later on, when he arrived, he was an unusual passenger. And that was a time when people were allowed to go up to the gate. There were a lot of devotees at the gate when Prabhupada came in, and there were many passengers that came through. And finally, Prabhupada came out of the gate, and all the devotees bowed down and gave him flowers, as they did every time he arrived in an airport. So we had organized a session for Prabhupada to chant. This was very much in the alternative hippie era, and there was a place called the Avalon Ballroom that was famous for having prominent rock and roll groups sing there or perform there, and it was run by a guy named Chet Helms, who was about 30 years old, or a little older than that, and he had hair down to his shoulders. And we used to joke about Chet Helms being a 30-year-old hippie, because hippies usually were in their early 20s, if anything. So this event we decided to have a group that was very famous at that time called the Grateful Dead perform. And one of my colleagues asked them if they would do it, and they said they would do it. But we needed other groups, and one of the devotees heard another group rehearsing. Their name was Moby Grape. They hadn't performed, but the Grateful Dead had performed in Avalon Ballroom about 30 times, and so it was kind of a famous place. But we added them to the bill, and this Avalon Ballroom was on the corner of two streets, Van Ness and Sutter Streets. And it was not on the ground floor. It was up one level. And at the top of the stairway leading to the upper level, I was taking tickets. It was my stint to take tickets. And it was so crowded, I think the capacity was 300 people. And the ballroom was about twice the size of this room, or maybe bigger, maybe 3 times the size of this room. And I was taking tickets, and people had to walk up the stairs to get the tickets, and it was so filled that the firemen who were standing guard at the base of the stairway outside would only let people in if someone came out. It was that filled to capacity, and it was on a Sunday night. Usually the concerts were on a Saturday night or a Friday night, but this one was on a Monday, a Sunday night, and it was unusual. And so I was taking tickets, and one of the people who came up to me was named Augustus Owsley, and someone from behind me said, but he doesn't have to have a ticket. He's a famous person. And we found out that he was manufacturing a drug called LSD. And he was so famous for doing that he had to be let in free of charge. And then another person came up the stairway named Timothy Leary, who was from a professor at Harvard, who was very, very prominent. He coined the phrase, tune in, turn on, drop out. And he encouraged people to take these drugs like marijuana and LSD. So, but when he reached up to where I was standing, he smelled like liquor. And I thought, well, this is a strange thing for a person who's advocating alternative methods of getting high to be drinking alcohol. And he went into a phone booth and made a phone call, and I never saw him again. He just disappeared into the phone booth. So he came there because it was advertised as a we didn't know what to call it, but we ended up calling it the Mantra Rock Dance. And not long ago, I was looking under the Avalon Ballroom on the web, and Avalon Ballroom, it had I'm going to pass this around, a picture, not right now, of a poster which includes Prabhupada, and the poster says, "Krishna consciousness comes west." Swami Bhaktivedanta, Allen Ginsberg, he agreed to come. He was a famous poet at the time. He's departed now, but he agreed to come because it was thought that the West Coast or San Francisco was the new Mecca for the alternative groups. They had rejected the alternative ways of life. By alternative ways, I mean not really alternative, but being their fathers were and grandfathers were lawyers and industrialists, and they had rejected that. So they thought that they would start something anew by coming to San Francisco and forming what were eventually called hippies. So this is interesting that I was looking under Avalon Ballroom, and it just, even though there were probably 30 or 40 different performances, they talked about the Mantra Rock Dance poster. And the Avalon Ballroom was a music venue in the Polk Gulch, it was called. And I'm going to read this section, if I can find it, that they talked about the Krishnas. On January 29, 1967, the Avalon Ballroom, hosted the Mantra Rock Dance musical event organized by the local Hare Krishna Temple, which featured Hare Krishna founder Bhaktivedanta Swami, along with Allen Ginsberg, the Grateful Dead, Moby Grape, and Big Brother and the holding company with Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin was also a famous singer at that time, and one time I saw her walking down Haight Street with a bottle of Johnny Walker in one hand, like a small bottle, not a quart, but half of a quart bottle, and two big dogs on a leash in the other hand. So that was her. And when this event took place, two people, Roger Hilliard and Ben Van Meter, I know they had a company. They had oils that seemed to merge into one another. I don't know if you've seen these psychedelic light shows, but they had oils of different colors, and the oils would sort of blend into one another and bounce off one another and break into globules, and that was projected onto the walls of the place. So it created a sort of psychedelic effect. And then over that, they had another slide that had the Hare Krishna mantra of 16 words, and it was projected over the oil. So everyone had a kind of a unique experience, a psychedelic experience. And Prabhupada spoke, and then he came in about 10 o'clock at night. This had been going on, and the prasadam that was organized was oranges cut into quarters, and all the people were eating them. And we started out with a little kirtan without Prabhupada, and everyone sort of made way for Prabhupada when they heard he was coming, and they separated. And it was kind of like the Red Sea parting. There were 300 people, and they made an aisleway down the middle for Prabhupada to enter. And there was a stage at one end of the ballroom where these groups performed. I'm going to pass this around now. This is a picture of the poster, and it's got a picture of Prabhupada on it. Let's see. You got to take this off. And So he didn't speak very long, but he asked Allen Ginsberg to speak. And he said, if you're having trouble, and he heard that there was an event where a person who had taken too much LSD was freaking out. And he was in a circle, in the circle of cars, automobiles, all facing the center. And when he started to freak out, they started flashing their lights, and they didn't know what to do with him. So they eventually, I mean, he had gone completely mad. They eventually called the police. And the police came. They just figured, well, they're just strange people doing strange things. But they picked him up, and they brought him to the Hare Krishna Temple, which was just around the corner from the local police station. And when I was asleep up in the upper floor of the same building, there was a building in the temple. It was 518 Frederick Street, and 512 was the apartment building. I heard this guy kind of wildly screaming, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. I didn't know what had happened. And but I couldn't sleep because it was so loud, even though it was 4 floors down. And I went down and let him in. And the devotees were fast asleep, but they all awakened and got up and chanted with him. And by their chanting, they calmed him down. And then at about 7 o'clock, when the first kirtan was taking place, a police car drove by and said, hey, Mike, here's your wallet. And they threw this wallet in the front door. And this guy named Mike, who was the crazy guy, just picked it up. It was he'd left it in the police car somehow. And the police were very happy that we were there and we were doing their job, because they couldn't calm the guy down. They were about to take him to a mental hospital, but they couldn't do anything. So they just thought, well, we'll take him over to the Hare Krishnas. Maybe they can do something. So they calmed him down. And after about 4 hours, he was chanting, and he was very regularly chanting. I was going to describe something that Dinabandhu wrote in one of his books called the Vrajalila Part 2. Prabhupada had arrived at an airport in, I think it was in Los Angeles in about 1973 or 74. And there was a whole incident that followed. But this book is I don't know if you know this book, but he was on several parikrams. Dinabandhu took people on. He'd lived there for about 30 years, and he knew Spanish and he knew Hindi and Brajabasi very fluently. And he used to take these people on parikrams and tell stories about this. And this is just one of the stories. I don't think we have time to hear the whole story now. But one of the devotees was very impressed when he saw Prabhupada for the first time, and he said that man is shining. And he was just an airport worker, but his statement was that, look at that man, he is shining. And people couldn't understand him because of his accent. But at first, but then Dinabandhu explained that was his observation, that Prabhupada was not an ordinary person, he was shining. So are there any questions or comments? About anything, doesn't have to be about this. Yes, class.
Can you expand a little bit on how the senses are created? Like, I was wondering, Maharaj, if you could expand a little, like, on the idea that we have senses, like, and you mentioned how, like, it never occurred to me before when you mentioned how the material world is made up of all these different creatures. We sort of take it for granted, but it's pretty interesting that the creation includes all these different types of consciousness, and we have senses. Anything you can help us with on that?
Well, Prabhupada says in the purport, false ego interacting with the different modes of material nature is the source of all materials in the phenomenal world. So this is a very difficult thing to understand, that from a subtle beginning come gross elements. Fire, earth, air, fire, water, and ether are the gross elements, and mind, intelligence, and ego are the subtle elements, but they're all bodily, and they're all created from subtle to, there's a progression from subtlety to grossness. And Lord Brahma is deputed to create the material world. So he creates these subtle senses, and they eventually become very gross. Like people are very after sense gratification in different forms of intoxication, in forms of what they see, in forms of what they hear, in forms of what they touch. So these are all created by the subtle elements. Yes?
Is it dependent on our attachment to those?
Sorry?
Thank you. Is it dependent on our attachment to those things? Like if it's becoming gross due to us being attached to these things that would otherwise be subtle?
Well, in the first sentence of the next purport of the next verse, Prabhupada says the chief function of the false ego is godlessness. So the point is that if we're forgetful of Krishna, or we're godless, which is what forgetfulness means, that we're godless, then we're happy to be gratified by the senses, which is hearing, touching, smelling, tasting. It progresses from godlessness, from forgetfulness of God, and Prabhupada doesn't spend a lot of time on the purport to the 31st verse, because he says that false ego interacting with different modes of material nature is the source of all materials in the phenomenal world, and that's the whole explanation. That's it. So I personally don't know what the process is of how something can migrate from a subtle sense to a gross sense, but apparently it does happen. So I don't know if that's much of an explanation, but anyway, that's what happens.
Okay, thanks.
Any others? Questions or comments? Okay, we'll stop there. Hare Krishna. You can keep that picture, by the way. It doesn't have to come back to me. It's available. It's on Google if you want to see it in big format. It's on the. You search for Avalon Ballroom, and somehow or other the Avalon Ballroom people, or the Google volunteers, decided to show that poster, even though many things were advertised. But that's what they showed, and they commented about the Hare Krishna's event, which didn't happen on a weekend. It happened on a Sunday. I mean, it was a weekend, but Saturday. It wasn't a Saturday or Sunday, or a Friday or Saturday. It was on a Sunday night. So it's kind of unusual that it appeared there. The Mantra Rock Festival, and this group called Moby Grape. One of the devotees who we were searching for groups, we agreed to have Ellen Ginsberg and the Grateful Dead and the what was the other group? There was another group that played, but they chose this thing on a Sunday night to be spoken of, the Hare Krishnas. January 29th, and Prabhupada came specifically for this event. I mean, we told him that we had an event lined up, and he was very happy to take part in it. Hare Krishna. Anything else? Okay, we'll stop.
Yes, I heard the devotees back in New York.
Sergeant?
I read that the devotees back in New York were very unsure about Prabhupada.
Yeah, the devotees in New York were. That was the beginning of the liberals and the conservatives. The New York people were very conservative, and they thought that the associating with hippies was too liberal, and we shouldn't have subjected Prabhupada to that whole situation. And of course, Prabhupada knew that there was something imperfect. He said this is no place for a brahmachari afterwards. But he took part and he spoke, and people danced and chanted. So it was, even though it was overly liberal, it had its benefits. Hare Krishna. Srimad Bhagavatam, bit of a current events.
ISKCON Mukunda Goswami.